Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at how climate change is reshaping our world,
Mm,
focusing on a place you might not expect,
okay.
the Charente Estuary in France.
Interesting.
We've got an academic essay that we're going to be looking at,
Okay.
and some really powerful images to help us understand this whole concept of terrain vague,
All right.
which isn't just some empty wasteland,
Yeah,
as you might think when you hear that
that's
term.
right. It's much more interesting than that.
Oh, good.
Terrain vague is all about that blurry line between land and water,
Okay.
a space that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by nature and by us.
So before we go any further,
Hmm.
help me understand this. What exactly makes the Charente Estuary a good example of terrain vague? I mean, what's it like there?
Picture this. You're standing in a vast, flat marshland.
Okay.
Canals and ditches cut through the landscape as far as the eye can see.
Right.
You're surrounded by water, yet it feels strangely absent.
Absent. How can water be absent when you're basically standing in a marsh?
That's the paradox.
Okay.
This seemingly natural landscape is actually the product of centuries of human intervention. Monks started draining the land back in the 10th century,
Wow.
but it was really in the 16th century, after years of neglect, that King Henri IV brought in Dutch engineers to really ramp up the effort. They built this intricate system of levees to separate the land from the water, making it suitable for agriculture.
So they essentially built a waterproof landscape on top of water.
Precisely.
Huh.
And that's where the cultural importance of these levees comes in.
Okay.
For centuries, they've represented stability and security in a naturally dynamic environment, but they've also created a kind of blind spot.
Okay.
By keeping the water at bay, they've made people less aware of the inherent flood risk.
And that brings us to Storm Xynthia in 2010. Right? That was a devastating reminder of just how powerful water can be.
It was Xynthia caused widespread flooding and loss of life along the French coast. And the essay uses this event as a starting point to ask, what if, instead of just reinforcing those levees,
Yeah.
we embrace the dynamism of water?
Okay.
What if we learn to work with it rather than against it?
Now, speaking of the past,
Yes.
the essay also argues that the Charente Estuary isn't just a product of human history.
Right.
There's a much deeper history at play here, a story written in the earth itself over millions of years.
That's right. The essay refers to it as deep time,
Okay.
the vast geological processes that have shaped this landscape over millennia.
So we're talking about really, really old stuff here.
We are.
But how does that deep time connect to the Charente Estuary we see today?
Well, it's fascinating. Old maps actually show how the estuary's shoreline has shifted dramatically over time,
Really?
advancing and retreating due to natural processes.
So like what we see as solid ground today
Exactly.
might have been underwater centuries ago
Yeah,
and could be again in the future.
it's possible.
Wow. Makes you think about how we define permanent, doesn't it? That's incredible. So are you saying that climate change could essentially reverse the process of land reclamation? It's been going on for centuries,
Yeah,
pushing the shoreline back.
it's a real possibility.
Wow.
Climate change projections suggest that sea levels could rise significantly in the coming decades,
Yeah.
potentially redrawing the map of the Charente Estuary. And the essay points out that events like Storm Xynthia, which seemed exceptional in the past,
Right.
are likely to become much more frequent by the end of the century.
Wow, that's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
So how do we adapt to this? What can we do?
Well, that's where this radical idea of a landscape laboratory comes in.
Okay.
The essay proposes creating a designated area in the Charente Estuary where we can study and experiment with different approaches to living with water in this changing environment.
A landscape laboratory. That sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I understand what that actually means. What would it look like?
Sure.
Would it be like a giant science experiment?
It's not a lab in the traditional sense.
Okay.
Think of it more as a living laboratory, a place for research, education, and demonstration all rolled into one.
Okay.
The essay draws parallels to similar projects in Scandinavia, where they're using landscape laboratories to explore how to design forests and other landscapes that are resilient to change.
So instead of trying to control nature,
Right.
this landscape laboratory would be about working with it, learning to adapt to its rhythms and its power.
Exactly. It's about embracing the idea of a floodscape,
A landscape.
a landscape that's designed to accommodate and even showcase flooding.
Okay.
The essay highlights successful examples like the Room for the River project in the Netherlands and the Isar plan in Munich,
Okay.
where they've created parks and public spaces that can be safely inundated during high water.
Okay. That's starting to make more sense.
Good.
But I'm still curious about how this would work in practice.
Sure.
How do you design a space that can withstand flooding while also being a place for people to live, work, and play?
Well, the proposed laboratory would be located in a meander of the river on a site that's currently protected by levees.
Okay.
And here's where the design gets really clever. Instead of just reinforcing those levees,
Yeah.
they're proposing to reshape them,
Interesting.
turning them into elevated promenades that would allow people to explore the landscape even during floods.
So you could be walking above the floodwaters, observing the changes in the landscape firsthand.
That's the idea.
That's a compelling idea.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how it would work in practice.
It's definitely an innovative approach.
Yeah.
And there's more. The design also manipulates the shape of the levees so that they can trap sediment carried by the tides,
Okay.
essentially using the forces of nature to help rebuild the landscape over time.
So it's a living, evolving landscape.
It is.
That's fascinating.
And the essay emphasizes that some areas within the laboratory would be left to evolve spontaneously,
Okay.
creating what it calls a third landscape.
A third landscape. What is that?
It's a space where nature is allowed to take its course with minimal human intervention.
Okay.
Imagine a space of unexpected beauty and biodiversity, a space that can teach us a lot about the resilience of nature.
Okay, so we've got these reimagined levees. We've got this third landscape. It sounds like a really dynamic and interesting space.
Yeah.
But before we get too lost in the design details, let's zoom out for a second.
Okay.
Why should we care about this landscape laboratory? What's the bigger picture here?
That's a great question. What's important here is that this project challenges us to rethink our relationship with water.
Okay.
For centuries, we've tried to control it to keep it separate from our lives.
Yeah.
But what if, instead of fearing it, we embraced its dynamism, its power to shape and reshape the world around us?
Okay.
What if we saw water not just as a threat, but as a source of opportunity and inspiration?
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
So this landscape laboratory is about more than just adapting to climate change.
It is.
It's about fundamentally changing our mindset.
Exactly.
And it's about creating spaces where we can learn to live with water in new and innovative ways.
Yeah.
This brings us to another key aspect of the proposed laboratory, its role as a public space.
Right.
So it's not just for scientists and researchers.
Not at all. The essay imagines a space where scientists, landscape architects, local communities, and visitors can come together to learn about the estuary, to experiment with different adaptation strategies, and to experience firsthand the beauty and power of this dynamic landscape.
That sounds amazing. So it's a place for research, education, recreation, and community building all in one.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, how do you get people on board with such a radical idea?
Sure.
I mean, wouldn't some people be resistant to the idea of embracing flooding?
That's a valid question, and one we'll explore further when we come back for part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned.